This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. Developers, take your marks. It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. It's time to deliver complex mission-critical applications in the fastest route possible. It's time to use any data from any source. It's time to embed analytics and create interactive user interfaces. So what are you waiting for? Choose your language. Choose your tools. Choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Done and done. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform, the fastest way to build applications. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Hello everyone, this is Felienne for Software Engineering Radio. Today with me on the show, I have Karl Hughes. He is a CTO at Great Network and he helps to make technology speakers succeed at CFP land. Welcome to the show, Karl.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Felienne.
So the topic of today's show is public speaking, and you actually wrote a book on how to get started with public speaking, and that's what this episode will cover. I would like to know first, why should engineers be good at public speaking? I mean, they're already good at engineering. So what are the reasons for people that they might be interested in improving their public speaking skills?
Well, I think that is kind of a personal decision. It comes down to what your goals are as an engineer or as in your career in general. So for me personally, what it came down to was kind of necessity. I started to move from individual contributor to team lead and then a manager a few years ago. And as I did that, I realized that a lot more of my day-to-day job was getting up in front of people and either presenting ideas that I had gathered from the team or maybe presenting progress on a project and then facilitating conversations and all this stuff that ended up being a lot more about the people and the conversations and the speaking than it was about the sort of writing code all day. And so for me, it was that movement into management kind of pushed me to start learning to become a better public speaker. I've met plenty of other engineers throughout the course of writing the public speaking guide. I talked to about 35 conference speakers, technical conference speakers, and they have a wide variety of reasons for wanting to get into public speaking. Some of them do it as part of their job. So there's a whole field that I had never even heard of before I started researching for this book called developer advocacy or developer relations. And these are technical developers who also go up in front of audiences at conferences and meetups and either promote a product or sort of show off an open source tool. So if you've been to many tech conferences, you've probably seen someone from Twilio or Auth0 speaking. And that's because they have whole teams that do this. There's also people who do this to promote their side projects. So I know a lot of developers have open source work that they want to kind of make sure other people hear about. And a great way to do that is to go to meetups or conferences and speak. So there's, again, like a wide range of reasons that people get into public speaking. It's hard to classify just a few of them, but I did kind of spend some time looking through and cataloging some of the most common ones. And those kind of hit the top of the list there.
And then your personal reason was actually not so much about public speaking, if I summarize that correctly. It was more about getting better at communicating in general. And you found that public speaking was a good way to practice how to explain your thoughts to people.
Yeah, that's right. So one thing I've found is that when you're giving a talk at, let's say, even a lunch and learn or a meetup or a conference, you have to take a lot of information that's in a variety of different sources and organize and distill it into something that people can comprehend in 45 minutes or less, maybe. And that's a really challenging communication skill. It's beyond just the act of getting up and saying some words on the stage. It's also organization, and it's the ability to understand who your audience is and where they're at currently at this point in time. So public speaking is really a lot broader than just the physical act of standing up in front of people and saying words. It's also about all those other things that happen behind the scenes, which I find really interesting and maybe surprising as I started to speak more in either business context or professional context.
Oh yeah, I like that perspective about how creating a talk is also about how to gather information and organize it. And we will definitely get back to that later in the show. But first, I would like to ask you to take people through the process of a conference organization. How do conferences find people, and how do you get in as a speaker into that process? This is something also you cover in the book quite extensively.
Yeah, so the book's directed at people who want to start giving technical talks at conferences. So mostly these are software engineers or managers or even developer relations people who just want to get on stage and start, presenting what they know for whatever reason. And so a big part of that new speakers have to overcome is, what do I do to actually like physically get on stage? Like, what are the steps you have to take before that point? And there's actually quite a bit that goes into it. So when you're organizing a conference, and I've never organized a conference personally, I've been running a meetup group for a little over a year now in Chicago. But when you organize a conference, one of the big parts of it is you have to find speakers. So conferences do this in a number of different ways. Some conferences, as they get more selective or larger, they might just only handpick speakers. But the broad majority of tech conferences today, especially the community-run ones and the ones that you might find in smaller regions, they open up what's called a CFP, or a call for proposals. Some people also call it call for papers. That kind of comes from academia. And what happens there is the conference organizers will open up a call for proposals for, let's say, 2 or 3 months. They'll take a bunch of proposals from speakers who potentially want to talk, and then they'll pick the top however many they have slots for. So some conferences, they may pick dozens of speakers. I've been a speaker at Code Mash before, and it's a huge regional conference in the Midwest. And they had, I want to say, over 100 speakers. So it was huge. Then there are smaller conferences. So I also last year spoke at a conference here in Chicago that had a single track, and it was about 200, maybe 250 attendees. And for them, they only had 8 speakers or 10 speakers, I think. And so it can vary quite a bit how many speakers actually get chosen. But either way, they'll open up this CFP process, and anyone who's interested can apply. Now, one of the big challenges, you have to find those CFPs that are open. So if you're speaking, there's a number of ways you can do that. CFP Land is just one of the many sites that tracks CFPs that are open. So there's a lot of great places out there. And eventually you'll start to build your own list. Once the speakers have all applied, or the CFP is closed, the conference organizers will then go through some process to figure out who's the best person to talk at their event. Now, there's a lot of different ways that they actually make the selection. In general, the conferences will put some idea of what they want speakers to talk about up front in the application. So they'll say something like, we're doing a React conference. We want you to submit talks about building production level scaled apps in React. And maybe there's 2 or 3 other things that they want to highlight. And generally, the speakers who have talks in that vein will probably get selected first. Now, that's not always true. They always are going to try to pick some variety. And so they may pick some talks that are what you might call soft talk, which is maybe more about managing teams with React, or how React solves business problems, or things like that, because those are tangentially related to the sort of core of the conference, but also really important for people to hear about. And the way that conferences actually then pick, which of these talks are best, that varies as well. So some will do a public voting system where they'll open it up to either former attendees of the conference, or maybe just people in their community, and say, which of these talks would you most like to see? And they'll just let the ones with the most votes win. Some will just review talks as they come in. They may have like a organizing committee that is in charge of reviewing all the talks and picking the best ones as they come in. And then some of them will not tell you anything about it. It's kind of a secretive process. And maybe it's just one person who handpicks every talk. So again, it can vary quite a bit. And you don't always know as a speaker, but sometimes they'll give you a little bit of insight into it. And so that's kind of a rough overview of the process. I don't know if I missed anything there. I know that there's kind of a lot to cover, like you said, and a little more is in the guide, but I'm happy to dive into specifics if you want to.
Yeah, at least this gives people some idea of what's going on behind the scenes. And then, of course, the question is, imagine I found a call for proposals of a conference I sort of like. Let's say it's about Python and I do Python programming. Then how do I know this conference will fit? Because there might be dozens of conferences about Python, and they might differ in scale and level. What is your strategy for selecting the right conference to apply to?
Yeah, so you mentioned the topic area is important. That's definitely the first criteria. If you're a speaker and you want to speak about Python, you probably don't want to go submit to a bunch of Ruby conferences. You're not likely to get picked, and your talks are just not going to be appropriate. So it's got to have the right topic area. The second thing you want to look at is this the right location, or is this a location I can realistically get to? So if there's one conference that happens in Antarctica every year, and if they aren't covering the cost of travel, that is a huge plane ride to get down there. So I think it's actually several plane rides and maybe a boat or something at the end. So think about the location, know that it's somewhere you could realistically get to. And what's interesting there is that a lot of conferences, it's probably about 50% of conferences will help speakers cover some of their travel costs. For a lot of other conferences, they maybe don't have the budget to do that. So you may want to talk to your employer about would they cover it if you got accepted. So location's a big part. And then next is the financial viability of you going. So again, if that conference is not going to cover any of your travel or hotel costs, are you going to be able to take those out of pocket? I've actually spoken at a couple conferences where they didn't cover the hotel, but I had a friend in town. And so I just stayed with my friend. And it's maybe not as glamorous as staying in the hotel for the conference itself, or not as easy because I had to do a little travel, but I did get to see somebody who I hadn't seen in a while. And so it's kind of fun to do that too. Once you get into speaking regularly, you're going to start thinking a little more about some other criteria. Like you said, there are a lot of conferences. At CFP Land, we index well over 400 or 500 tech conferences every year. And I know there are more that I don't know about. And so a big part of what experienced speakers look for is reputation. So I'm in a speakers Slack group, for example, that whenever a new CFP or a new conference comes online, a lot of speakers will go in and ask other speakers, has anybody been to this one or applied to this one? What is it like there? Do they take care of their speakers? Are they thinking about things like diversity and inclusion? Are they a reputable organization? Is it for profit, not for profit? There's a lot of things there that you can dig into. Now, when you are early on speaking, it's maybe your first couple conferences, you may not consider everything like that. You may just take whatever you can get. But at some point, you're going to want to become a little more selective in your choices.
Yeah, that makes sense. This goes for a lot of things in life, I guess. So imagine you have found a conference that you think, this fits and it's in a location that I would like. Now what? So I know some stuff about, let's say, Python again. How do I know what of everything of a programming language or a framework, what specific part could be interesting for that conference?
Yeah. So when you sort of pick out some CFPs or conferences that you want to submit to, you're going to go find their CFP page, and you're going to see, when's it due? You're going to see, do they cover travel and hotel? And they're probably also going to include some tips for submitting your CFP. So it might be stuff like, at this Python conference, we are going to focus on machine learning topics. And so if that's the case, you want to think about what topics do you already know about or have already spoken about that would match that criteria. Now, this kind of like, I'm sort of jumping the gun a bit here because assuming you have some knowledge about, let's say, a topic like Python, you also need to decide what are you actually going to speak about. And usually speakers will start by having 2 or 3 abstracts that they've written, and I'll get into abstracts in a second, but they'll have 2 or 3 abstracts they've written, and they'll look for conferences that are good fits to submit them. And so you may find that there's 20 Python conferences happening in the next few months, but only 4 or 5 of them are really good fits for one of the talks that you've already got ready to give. And so you may only submit to those, or you may try a couple others that are sort of an okay fit or something like that. You never know. You might get in anyway. Now, abstracts is kind of I mentioned that, but I didn't explain what that is, so I'll back up here. When a conference opens its call for proposals, they will ask you to submit a talk title, an abstract, and maybe some other supporting information or documents. The title is just a catchy, like, quick way to refer to your talk, and there's sort of a whole art to writing good titles for talks I won't dive into quite yet. And then the abstract is usually a one or two paragraph kind of what is the talk, and sometimes that abstract will go directly into the conference's program. So you want to think about who's the audience that's going to be reading this abstract. It's going to be the organizers who are making the conference, but ultimately it's going to be the developers and attendees at the conference itself. So you need to think, how could I write this, a description of my talk that's super compelling for that audience? Once you've got your abstract written, they may also ask you for some things like, have you given talks like this before? They may ask to see a video, so you may put a link in. They may ask for links to your social media accounts, because to be perfectly honest, a lot of conferences are looking for speakers that have some presence online, or at least something out there that they can kind of vet that you're reliable, that you're going to show up, that you're not going to get on stage and lock up or get really scared. So this kind of works back a little bit here. But what a lot of speakers will do is they'll try to give their talks at a meetup group, a local meetup group or a user group in their area before they start submitting to conferences. And that can really help, because you can get it recorded. You can kind of get some feedback from the audience. You can understand a little better how this topic is really going to resonate with people in my target audience before you actually get into submitting it to conferences. Also helps build some credibility and some confidence in public speaking. So I've talked a bit about the conference is going to open up the CFP. You're going to submit an abstract, and you're going to want to think about, whether it fits for the conference. Is it a topic that you actually care about and you're excited about giving a talk on? When I interviewed all the conference speakers for the book, the big thing that came across in a large majority of them was that they really cared about the topics they talked about. And it's funny because, I may not get super excited about, queues and Redis or something, but there's somebody out there who does. And there's somebody out there who knows a ton about it and gives talks on it. And they probably really like that topic, really interested and fascinated by the technical intricacies there. So find something that is actually exciting for you, because at the end of the day, you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about and learning about this topic. And if you're not excited about it, it's going to come across in your talk. Next, you want to think is this a topic that I actually know pretty well? One great way to come up with talk ideas is to think about your last several big projects you worked on at work. Now, there's sometimes you have to be careful about what you say about your work up on stage, because there may or may not be privacy or security concerns. So you'll have to clear all this with your boss and sometimes legal groups, but depends on the company you work for. Either way, if you've worked on a project, so for example, a friend of mine was trying to come up with a talk idea. He kept saying, I don't know, I've worked on anything really that unique. And I asked him, what are the last 2 or 3 projects you've done? And he mentioned internationalizing an app. And I was like, that's awesome. I've worked as a software engineer for almost 10 years, and I've never had to deal with internationalization. And it's like he didn't even realize that was something that a lot of us probably never had to do, especially if we worked in small niche US markets and things like that. And so it's really interesting once you start running some of your projects by your friends, you'll start to hear, oh, I've never done that. That would be interesting. So those are some good ways to come up with talk ideas. And then from there, once you've written your abstract, you can start submitting that to conferences. And then usually conference speakers will actually have their abstract ready long before they have their slides and presentation. So maybe we'll get to slides and presentation in a bit, but that kind of gives you an idea about how you submit that abstract and how you actually pick a good topic.
I really like that advice. I'm going to summarize it briefly. I think your main takeaway for selecting a topic was look at what you've done in the past few months or years, and then bounce ideas off of friends, other programmers that you know. And then if you have a vaguely defined idea, find a meetup or a lunch and learn and work, and then practice the talk there. So just so you have video and you have an idea of what the talk will be about. And then if you've done that, that would be a good time to submit your abstracts to call for proposals, right?
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a great summary.
So now let's get to talk selection. Imagine you have this nice abstract. Now what? What do we know about reasons that speakers get selected or do not get selected at conferences? What are some tips that you could give us to write a good abstract to actually get into the conference?
Yeah, it's really hard to know exactly, because most conferences are organized by a group of people, and usually they'll try to get a somewhat diverse, knowledgeable group of people at different skill levels to review all of the abstracts that get submitted. And they're looking for a few things, and it's hard to know in what proportion they're looking for each thing. So one is they want to see that your topic and abstract are well thought out and unique, and that they are compelling, and so it sounds like something you could get excited about. The next thing they might be looking at is, do we have a good blend of topics? So for example, if I submit a talk about, let's say using Laravel, a PHP framework or something, and I submit that to a PHP conference, but then the organizer of Laravel submits a talk about his framework, the guy who created Laravel submits a talk about his framework as well, then I am not going to get accepted because they're going to want a blend of topics, and it's unlikely that they'll pick me over the person who is the creator of the framework. Another thing that comes into play is the speaker's reputation. So every time you go, I guess like tech conference speaking, while there's hundreds of events, it's actually a pretty small world. I found that a lot of conference speakers get to know each other, and a lot of the organizers are also speakers, so they get to know other speakers and organizers, and it ends up becoming like there's a lot of reputation that gets passed around. So you can do a lot to build your reputation that is not even speaking. One thing you can do is contribute to or work on open source projects. You could start speaking again at meetups or maybe local boot camps. That's been a really helpful way for me to kind of get up on stage a little bit. And you'll start to develop as you go to these things, you'll meet people, you'll develop a bit of a reputation as a speaker. And then it gets easier to get accepted at conferences as well because they've heard your name around. There's also, are you actually qualified on this topic? And I don't want to turn beginners off because actually a lot of conferences now are also looking explicitly for people who are in the first 5 years of their career to give talks because they want a diversity of skill ranges. But a lot of technical conferences are looking for people who are really well qualified on the topic. So if you have been working in, let's say, Java for 10 years, you've got a better shot getting accepted, giving an advanced Java talk at a conference than if you just started last year. And that's going to show up on your either LinkedIn or your Twitter or whatever you've been doing. And then, like I kind of touched on in the last point, a lot of conferences are starting to look at how can we get a diverse pool of speakers. And diversity doesn't just mean, the skin color and gender. It also means, like, are we getting people who are new to the topic? So if you think about it, conference attendees come in and they have a wide range of experience levels. So it's great if you have speakers who also have a wide range of experience levels. And you then want to kind of do the job, the organizers will do the job of matching up the beginner talks with the beginner attendees and the advanced talks with the advanced attendees. And I think that's really great. It's awesome to get this blending of different skill levels, because while I may be a senior, PHP developer, I may be a junior Rails developer. And so I may want to go to those kinds of beginner talks, even though I'm a senior person in some other topic. There's no, we're all beginners at something. Once the conference has kind of like started to narrow down their talks, some of it becomes logistical. So they've got to find speakers who are still available. So they may send out a, hey, we've accepted you to speak, but you may or may not actually be able to speak because maybe you committed to something else or a family event came up. And so that's a whole nother topic. But that gives you a little idea on what conferences are looking to do as they fill out their schedule of speakers for an event.
So this is a tough question because I'm not sure what my own opinion on this is, but is it okay as a speaker or maybe even as a beginning speaker to reach out to conference organizers around or outside of the call for proposals? Is this a total no-go, or is this actually a smart way to get some information on what the conference might be interested in?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea. I think I'll just warn you and say it's going to be tough to get much FaceTime or much phone time with conference organizers. I've found that a lot of the conference organizers are very busy people. And even in the off season when, it's not time for their conference, they either have a full-time job they work at, or they may do other kinds of event marketing for for their company. So it's not a bad idea if you get the chance to talk to an organizer. Let's say that, you really want to go talk at Angular JS Conf and you meet somebody who's in charge of running it. It may be great to, sit down and have a 30-minute conversation with them, but it also may be really hard to do because they might be really busy. Another way you could sort of tackle that same problem of like, I want to know more about the conference before I commit to speaking or before I submit. You could talk to former speakers at that conference. They might be a little more available. One thing that I found talking to conference speakers is that they are generally very helpful people that want to make the world a better place, and they want to lift other speakers up, which is really great. It's an awesome community to be part of. So what I might encourage you to do if you're a new speaker and you want to learn more about it is maybe find 2 or 3 people in your city who have spoken at conferences before, or even come up to someone who speaks at a conference that you go to and ask them, hey, could we go get coffee sometime? I'd love to just hear more about the process of getting accepted here at these specific conferences. I think you're very likely to get time with them on the books.
That is really a lovely idea. And I just want to say, if people want to reach out to me to talk about conference speaking, I would be totally open. So
yeah, me as well.
Invitation stands for the audience, and you as well. That's really lovely. Okay, so I think we've covered getting into conferences enough now. I want to get into actually doing the presentation, because previously you already mentioned when you submit an abstract, you just submit a title and abstract. You don't have to have your slides and your presentation all finished. And I think, in all honesty, most speakers actually do not have their slides entirely finished unless it's maybe like a recap of a talk they've already done. So, okay, my talk is accepted. Now what? How do I prepare? What do I do? Help, Karl.
Yeah, exactly. And that's you're totally right. Most of the speakers I interviewed for this whole guide were in that same boat. They would write maybe 3 or 4 abstracts at the beginning of the year. They would start submitting them to conferences and just see which ones got accepted. And then as one got accepted, they'd figure out how to make the slides and all that. Now, if you're a first-time speaker, it might be a good idea to have given the talk because it's going to be a good practice. But once you get into this, you can sort of start to think about, I know the topic pretty well. I could write an outline, so I can probably come up with a presentation here. So once you get accepted, and assuming that the timing works out and you can go and they want you to go and you can pay for it and all that stuff, which there's a lot to that, but that happens first. Now you've got to think about, okay, what does my presentation for this topic? There's a lot of ways you can do this. I like to break this down into 4 sort of core formats that people use for talks. Now, this is not exhaustive. There's probably lots of other variations on each of these, but just to help you categorize things. The first format that I see a lot is a novel solution to a common problem. So this is like where, someone at a big company, let's say Google, has some really weird, has a very common problem, but they have this unique spin on it because they're big enough, they're Google, they come up and build their own tool for it. So I think that's how Google got into Kubernetes, was essentially like they're running lots of Docker containers. They realized that it's not quite working. They kind of come up with this really novel solution for it. And there's a lot of people who go talk about Kubernetes from Google because of that relationship and that project. That may be a bad example. I don't know a ton about the internals of Google and how they came up with that. But that's a really good format, because what it's letting you do is sort of lots of people have this common problem. Now, your solution is specific to you, but at least they're going to start thinking in terms of, oh, okay, that's how they solved it. Maybe I can solve it kind of similarly. Another topic that I've seen done this way is like, there was a lot of microservices have kind of been on the rise, and then on the less sort of more stable side of things. Anyway, they were really cool a few years ago. A lot of people were talking about them, and there's lots of common problems that come up once you start building in microservices. So there's, how do you deal with communication, dropping connections between services? How do you deal with munging data between multiple services? And lots of people came up with different novel solutions for this and had great conference talks around it. So that's another way that you can sort of structure a talk. Another common way of structuring talks, and this is kind of goes beyond technical talks, but is called the hero's journey. So this is a pattern for storytelling. And the way I break it down, I kind of make a simplified version in the guide. But first of all, you introduce yourself in some kind of happy initial state. Everything's working well at your job. Everything's going great. And the code is getting deployed and working all the time. And then something happens that upsets your initial state. Maybe there's all of a sudden this really hard to track down bug. Nobody can figure it out. And it's come to you to fix it. And then you reluctantly start your journey to resolve that conflict. So you say, all right, what are the things I can try? You start trying things. You sort of walk through all the different things you tried. You kind of maybe bring the audience in to suggest things and all that. And then you reach sort of a low point where your initial assumptions and everything you've tried has failed. And you're really having a hard time. And then maybe something finally clicks. And whether that's because maybe a coworker came in and helped you out, or it's a book you read that finally unlocked it, or you just went and took a long walk and all of a sudden you realize what the problem was you were trying to solve, how you could do that. And you emerge victorious is kind of the way that the hero's journey ends. And this is like the pattern that every every action movie sort of follows. And so it's not a bad idea to make that part of your conference talk. It's a great way to give yourself some framework here. Another framework that people use is the tech heavy deep dive. So this is something where you go into a really, really niche problem. So instead of going for a common problem in your novel solution, you go into a really weird novel problem that not everyone or very few people will have. And then you get really technical with solving it. So these are those low level talks that get into like memory management in some kind of assembly language and stuff like that, which I find super interesting because I am usually in my day-to-day job, I'm a very high-level programmer working in these web languages, and so it's really cool to get back into this deep tech stuff. And a lot of people do a good job talking like that. And if you can take that really deep technical content and make it approachable for a broader audience, that's a super powerful skill to have. And the last kind of way to structure a talk is the live demo. Live demos are super impressive and super challenging and really risky. I've seen them go very, very poorly. I've also seen them go really, really well. So if you can pull it off, great. But there's a lot of ways you can kind of mitigate your risk, but be really careful. Get really good at this. Practice it a ton. It is really hard to do.
Developers, take your marks. It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. It's time to deliver complex mission-critical applications in the fastest route possible. It's time to use any data from any source. It's time to embed analytics and create interactive user interfaces. So what are you waiting for? Choose your language. Choose your tools. Choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Done and done. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform, the fastest way to build applications. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into live coding a little bit later in the episode. For now, I just want to summarize those 4 different storylines that people could use if they're designing a talk. So one is the hero story. One is a live demo that we will get into. One is an existing problem that people might be able to relate to, but then presenting a novel solution. And then the final format you talked about was this tech deep dive that really involves the nitty gritty details.
Yep.
So that might definitely help people to get into a story. What type of presentation am I designing? And that might be even helpful, I'm thinking now, not just in creating the slides, but also in writing the abstract. You could have that in mind of what type of talk is this going to be? So how do I describe it also to make it clear to the organizers which of the 4 this one is?
Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
So how do you learn to create such a story? I have the 4 now, but now what? Like, what can I do to get better at this? I mean, clearly read your book, but also what other tips do you have for practicing?
Yeah, I think one is start watching good conference talks critically. And the great thing is that we live in an age where like video is on YouTube almost immediately after every conference. It's great. Like even if you can't afford to attend every conference, which nobody can, you can get online and find videos on almost every major tech conference. And you can find some of the keynote speakers, some of the smaller speakers, and you can get a great idea of how they give these talks, and you can decide which parts of their talks you like and don't like, and which sort of methods they use that you do and don't like. So there's not really a right answer to this. A lot of it comes down to finding what works for you as a speaker and what kind of resonates with your audience. So I'll say first, like watch talks, because I think that's a really good way to get ideas about how you could deliver a talk and what kind of methods you could use. And then the next thing is start giving talks and practicing a lot. And practicing is the step that I think a lot of people early on miss, and it shows. And when there's a couple ways you can practice. So the first thing, as you start to develop a talk, you're going to start to have an outline, and then maybe you'll get a few slides. Start to actually pretend like you're actually giving it. So book a conference room in your office and give it in front of an empty room. And see how it feels. See if it's actually starting to flow and make sense. And you're starting to get some ideas about how people would actually respond to this. And then as you do that more and you get more comfortable with that, you start to refine your outline, your slides, you kind of get the whole thing going. And then you want to start giving that in real life. And so maybe first give it to a few coworkers just to try it out. Like a little lunch and learn is always nice. Give it to a local meetup or two. Give it to, you can, call up some area code boot camps and see if they're interested in having you come give it as a talk. You could then start applying to conferences with it, and you'll have it really well refined by the time you actually get there in front of a larger audience at a conference.
Yeah, I really like both of those tips. Definitely practicing is something that really helps. And the other tip you mentioned was watch talks critically. And that sounds nice, but actually, I don't think it's so easy to actually critically look at talks. And that brings me to another question. Actually, before the show, I asked you, could you give a few of your favorite talks and what you like about them? So this might be a good time to talk about those two talks that you mentioned before the show. We will link to those in the show notes so you can look at them and then listen to the rest of the episode if you don't want it to be spoiled. Those talks were Sandi Metz on code smells at Laracon and Nicholas Means about the 3 Mile Island at the Lead Dev Conference. And I'd really like to hear from you. Why did you select those talks? What is so great about them? What can people take away from watching those talks if they're going to watch the talks after the interview?
Yeah, I rewatched those talks this weekend because it's been a couple years since I had seen them live. I saw both of them live do these, and I've seen these particular two speakers. I've watched a lot of their other talks because they just both fascinate me, and for different reasons. So start with Sandi Metz. She's a big presence in the Ruby community, and I'm not a Ruby person, but I still think that her talks a lot of times are very approachable to anyone. And she's very much a programmer's programmer. She really thinks about programming as a craft and making code better. And that detail level stuff is really interesting and kind of fun to watch, because a lot of times I forget that, there is a way you're trying to always make things better. And it kind of takes me back down to that. In this particular talk, she's talking about code smells, which is a way to sort of identify maybe anti-patterns or problems or potential problem areas in a code base. So it's great. They all have really unique and funny names. And so that's kind of part of the fun of this talk. But she talks at the beginning about her personal challenge in understanding and categorizing code smells and how challenging that was for her at first. And instead of then maybe spending one slide per smell and just going here's a definition of this code smell, here's a sample, here's a definition, here's a sample. She could have done that. I think that would have been the natural inclination for a lot of speakers. But instead, she sort of grouped them together, and her slides are just an image that illustrates the smell, and then she just talks. And her ability to explain something in this natural conversational way, it just shows you she knows this topic really, really, really well. And I think that when that comes across, it's really powerful. One thing that I've noticed a lot of really good speakers do, including Sandi in this talk, is they don't include a lot of text on their slides. They include maybe a key word or a key phrase and a big image to sort of illustrate it, but then they speak, and they know that the audience can only either watch the slides and read the slides or hear them talk. And internalizing that takes some time. I still struggle with this. A lot of my talks I feel like are still too text heavy, and I'm aware this is a problem, but it's still really it's hard to overcome, because as a speaker you're often thinking, well, I want to make sure they see this definition, and so therefore I'll put it up there. But the truth is the audience can't do both. They can't read and listen to you at the same time. So she does a great job with that. The other thing that I take from this talk is that it's really inspiring. And it's hard to make a talk that is about such a mechanical topic, code smells, inspiring. But honestly, it comes off that way. It's you can make your code better. You can take any code base and improve it by just applying these smells and common refactoring patterns that she includes in her talk. So I really like talks that you walk away from and you go, yes, I can be better. That can make me, I can actually use this. And this is something I can take right to it's very actionable for my day-to-day life as a programmer. On the other hand, here we've got Nicholas Means. He gives a lot of talks that are in this similar vein as this one. It's about what I think it's called Who Destroyed 3 Mile Island, or Who Failed at 3 Mile Island.
Yeah, I don't know. I just have the 3 Mile Island as a title in my notes.
I'm going to look at it real quick. Yeah, it's called Who Destroyed 3 Mile Island. So
Okay.
Nicholas Means is he's a great storyteller. I got to speak at this conference, the lead developer, a couple of years ago, and he was one of the keynotes, and this was his talk. And the whole thing is just a story. It's like he jumps in and you forget that you're watching a presentation. It's much more like it feels like you're watching like a documentary by a really good, knowledgeable source. And he starts it off with a personal connection, which, Sandi started her talk off with a personal connection. Nick starts his off with a personal connection. I think there's something to learn there, that personal connection is a really great way to get the audience grounded and to let them know that you are a human who is not just going to like lecture to them. You are also thinking, and you have problems, you have challenges, and that's great. He has very few words on any of his slides. I mean, it's like he even put some technical diagrams up there to illustrate how nuclear power plants work, but it's not like they're full of jargon or anything. It's like they're very understandable, simple pictures that you can take away from. And he does a couple things then in the actual throughout the talk. So one is he explains a really complex process, which is nuclear power generation, which for most people in the audience who are software engineers, we didn't know much about that topic probably. So he kind of walks through the basics of that. And the whole talk is only 30 minutes. So it's not like he has a ton of time, but he makes it very digestible and understandable. And I think that's something I've noticed that a lot of good speakers do, and I try to emulate myself, is like make a really big, complex topic understandable and digestible by anyone in any audience. And he does a good job of that. Finally, he's really polished in what he does. It's like he's not reading from a script, but it feels like he knows almost every word that he's going to say. I don't think he says or once. And he's not like, looking down and reading notes the whole time. Kind of looking at it critically, I think he does maybe have a couple moments where he has to go check his slide notes, speaker notes, but it's not like it's the whole time he's sitting there reading. So it feels very organic. And then finally, he's bringing it all together and making the whole thing into a memorable story that's actually applicable and, again, actionable. So it's great when people tell a story, but like you got to remember what's the takeaway. And I think Nick could have gotten up on stage and he could have just said, don't blame people when things go wrong, just fix the process. But instead of saying it 30 different ways, he just told one big story that illustrated exactly that point. And if you remember that story, you're going to remember his point. And it's hard to forget that story once you watch it, because it's just a really fascinating story from an engineering and reliability standpoint.
So really some great takeaways from those stories. I'm going to summarize it. I think you said it's very important that you, as a speaker, you have a personal connection to the topic, because then you also create a personal connection to the audience. They will care about you, and then they care about what you have to say. You have to think about what are the takeaways for your audience's daily life as programmers. If you have a complex topic, make it simple and understandable. Put it in a nice story and make sure that everything is very polished, that you look, probably because of practice, you look like you're telling it just to someone in a pub or in a plane, like that it's just this thing I tell you, rather than a memorized presentation. That actually also brings me to the next topic, because one other thing you said is you shouldn't have too much text on your slides. And I was going to ask you, do you have any tips for slide design? So I guess not too much text is one of them. Do you have any others?
Yeah, one thing that I've found a lot of good speakers do is they have a consistent pacing of their slides. So what I mean by that is there's a general rule of thumb that in business, like in a business setting, you probably want to think that each slide will probably be about a minute on average. Now, that's not true necessarily in all contexts. So for example, I've seen some speakers that come up with, for a 30-minute long presentation, they may have 200 slides because they move really quickly. It's like each slide is a really quick little thing that almost like each slide's a bullet point. Whereas other speakers spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes or more per slide. So what you want to do is think about, like, what is my pacing going to be? How often am I going to be clicking through slides here? Do I want it to be really fast? Do I want it to be really slow? Do I want it to be around that average of a minute per slide? I found myself personally, I tend to hit around a minute a slide, but that's something that's a lot of speakers, I think, don't think about. And then there's a lot of I don't know what I would call this, sort of the mechanical stuff about slides themselves. So you want to use large fonts. You want to use few words because it gets hard to read. You want to also think about the size of screen that the slides will be projected on. So, for example, if you're at a meetup group, it might just be a small projector or a large TV even at an office, and so you might not be able to cram a lot of stuff on there. You may not want to put any very small text. Whereas sometimes at conferences, they have a huge screen and it'll be replicated across the room. And so you'll notice that sometimes speakers will just put their Twitter handle very small on the bottom of every slide. And it's okay because it's blown up so big, people can find it or see it. So you kind of want to know the size that you're going to be on if you can get it. That's one of those things that if you're accepted to a conference, you can always ask the organizers about. Some other things, have good contrast and think about that color contrast on slides. So this kind of we've started to become more aware of accessibility when it comes to web development, but it's still something that has probably got a lot of room for improvement in conference and speaking sort of side of things. And one thing you can do there is think about the large portion of the population that's colorblind or has some level of colorblindness or maybe vision impairments and things like that. So ideally, the conference is doing some kind of either live transcription so that there are subtitles. You probably don't have to worry about that. But if you can, subtitles or sign language, depending on what they've got anyway. But if you can, think about your color schemes and making it a good contrast. So black and white or yellow and dark blue, so things stand out against each other well. I think that covers some of the basic things that come up about presentations. There's sort of a whole discipline about figuring writing good slides or building good slides. And so I don't cover that in the book in a ton of detail because I think there are some good resources out there, but I link out to some resources that are good for coming up with slides and making sure they are very presentable.
Yeah, I think the most important things you said were related to readability. So make sure the font is big and the contrast is okay. And also I really liked your tip about pacing, like how many slides you want to have per minute and is it sort of the same throughout the entire talk. That sort of relates to talk delivery. So that would be my next question. What are your tips for delivering the talk? So this pacing is both related to slide design, but also related to delivery. And also in the talks that we looked at together, you said it's important that it's polished and it has this storytelling feeling about it. What are other tips you would have about delivering the talk?
A lot of it comes down to practice, to be honest, because the more you practice, the better your delivery will get. The more you practice in front of a live audience, the better your delivery will get, because you'll react to how real people react to what you're saying. And so you'll start to learn which parts to pause at, which parts to do to emphasize, which parts to maybe cut from the presentation. So that's by far the biggest tip is that. Some other things that I like to think about are, one, try not to read from your slides, if at all possible. There's ways you can do that by you could have your presenter notes maybe show up on your screen while the slides are behind you. This is something, though, that a lot of speakers maybe find hard to set up, and so they don't do initially. If you don't need notes, that's kind of even better. If you kind of know what each slide is going to be, and then you are able to sort of maybe you've given the talk so many times that you can just hit those highlights without notes, that's great. But a lot of people find that having those notes is a good backup plan in case they really get flustered or lose track. Another thing that a lot of good speakers have told me and that I agree with is to memorize your very first sentence, your opening line, because to be honest, that is once you get past that, things kind of roll downhill. You've got a little momentum. So maybe you memorize your first paragraph of what you're going to say, just so that you get on stage, those lights hit you, and this is the first thing I say. Because I found a lot of first-time speakers especially, it's like once you're actually up there, everything changes. Everything you practiced and learned is like thrown out the window because it's a little scary when you've got 100 people out in an audience looking at you for the first time. So practice that very first line, but don't make the whole thing so rehearsed that you are basically reading. Make it feel at least somewhat organic. If you can get audience participation throughout the talk, that is a really great way to kind of make your talk a little more, it stands out, it's a little more interactive. So that can be as simple as asking a question, maybe asking people, have you worked with React before? Raise your hand. And you'll get, good percentage of people will just they'll wake up a bit once they have to raise their hand and think about a question. That's helpful. You can also go further and do I've heard of speakers and seen speakers who do more almost interactive sessions for their talks. Now, this is a little hard to pull off. It can depend on the venue, but you can get audience participation in talks. You can have people come up on stage with you if you want to illustrate a point. You could give the audience paper and have them work on some little thing. Again, that's all kind of hard to pull off, and it just depends, but it's a great idea to get the audience involved in some way. And then some other things to think about are your first and last slide. So this is pretty mechanical, but one of the things that you probably want to do is have like a cover slide that'll sit up there on the screen while you get set up and while the switchover happens between speakers. So that'll be up there for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. So having something up there that's a good introduction to what this talk is, like the title of the talk, maybe even your handle on social media so that people can follow you or tweet along with it, is a good idea. And then the final slide as well, you can either have like anybody got questions slide where there's a placeholder for questions, or you may tell people, that I'll take questions in the hallway afterwards, or here's my email or Twitter handle so you can follow up with questions if you want. Another thing that a lot of speakers try to do that is tricky to do as well is humor. And I've seen some speakers who are really funny. They just kind of naturally know what a good way to get a rise out of the audience is without crossing the line into controversy. But I've also seen a couple of speakers who crossed the line into something that they probably shouldn't have said on stage and had to go back and apologize for it. And so I would just caution you to be very mindful of any kind of humor. Humor just in general, it tends to, if you do try to use it, try to use positive humor. So maybe self-deprecation is okay, but don't do it at the expense of making fun of other people, because you never know who's in that audience and who's going to hear that or what they've been through. And so be very careful with anything that's dark or edgy in your humor. So those are some things that I've heard and taken away from a lot of speakers I've interviewed with. There's again, with presenting, there's a lot of different topics and tips that are out there. Another one that personally I adhere to is to try not to get stuck standing right behind the podium. Some speakers like that, and that's okay, but a lot of speakers you'll find like to walk around a little on stage and kind of use their hands, be very expressive, be very engaging in their body language. Because you have to remember, just because you're on stage, it doesn't mean that body language communication isn't happening. So a lot of, I don't know what they say, like 90% of communication is nonverbal or something. And that's true when you're on stage as well. So if you don't look engaged, you're not moving around, you don't have like expressions on your face, the audience is going to have a really hard time reading you and telling what they should be taking away from this talk and what parts are important or not. So those are some highlights. I'm sure there's plenty of other things that I could throw in, but I'll kind of leave it there.
Yeah, that was a lot. So I'm going to try to summarize a few things of what you said. So the final thing you said is use body language, try to use the entire stage so people can connect to you more easily. Memorize your first few sentences so that you don't have to worry about the beginning, and then it sort of rolls from there. Those were tips I think you said were generally applicable. Then you also said some things are good but hard to do, like audience participation. It can be really helpful to get feedback, but it can also fall flat if people don't reply. And also humor, of course, if you can do it, if it fits you, it's very nice, but you have to make sure that it fits, because there might be cultural differences and your humor might not resonate with everyone. And be sure to make yourself the butt of the joke and not other people, because that might not be all that funny to everyone. So those, I think, were some of the tips that you said, all very helpful and good to keep in mind. Then there's one topic that I would like to talk about before we close off this episode. We talked about it briefly already, and that are live demos. When we talked about it earlier, you said they're really cool, but they're also sort of risky. So let's look at the positive side of it first. What do you think live coding adds to a talk that just showing slides couldn't?
Yeah. So there's in the guide, I kind of linked to this one talk where there's a guy, and let's see if I can find, his name's Andrew Sorensen, and he does live programming demos where he creates a whole concert basically live. So he uses this looping program and this code to actually write music on the stage. it's amazing. I mean, you see that, and he has a 10-minute time slot, and he actually gets this whole like mini concert going in this program that he's writing. And it's really cool because you see him live writing and screwing up occasionally and fixing it, and it's inspiring. I mean, it makes you as an audience member think, oh, well, if this guy can do it on stage in 10 minutes, surely I can do something, meaningful with my free time, when I want to go build something. And I think that inspiration factor gets really high when you can do it live. For a lot of live demo speakers, what they're trying to illustrate is how easy something is. So maybe they're using an open source library they really like or they built, and they're just showing this is how quick it is to get your website up and running using this tool, or to provision a database using this tool, or what have you. And showing that you can do it live in a few minutes sort of shows the audience that this isn't something they need to be afraid of. It's not as scary as they might have thought initially. So that's the plus side. That's where I think live coding does really well in those contexts.
So the added value is, I think you said, like giving inspiration mainly. That if people look at people doing it, actually, they're like, oh, I could do it because I saw all the steps and there's no hidden magic that I don't know about.
Exactly.
That's the added value, right?
Yeah.
So then also you said it's risky. Then what are the risks that you take on if you decide to do live coding in a talk?
Yeah, well, if you've been to a few conferences, you've probably seen someone's live code demo screw up. Unfortunately, it's very common. And I remember one a young guy who was a first-time conference speaker. He was going to try to give a live demo of this tool, and he lost the code. Something happened. It didn't get saved, and he didn't have his demo, essentially. And he was really flustered. It was very difficult. In fact, a couple of the audience members got up on stage with him to help him out a little, which was really nice because he was really struggling. And so first of all, if you do decide to go high risk and do something live, know that the audience is rooting for you. So when it screws up, don't get up there and think to yourself like, oh gosh, if this messes up, I should just leave and never do this again. Sort of take a step back and remember that the audience wants you to succeed because they came to see this thing happen. And so you might even get somebody in the audience who's willing to help you out, or you may find that, there's a silver lining in it. On the flip side, you can do some things to help mitigate the risk there. So a big thing is make sure you have some kind of backup in case your live demo doesn't work. So one of the things that inevitably happens is you get into a conference and the Wi-Fi goes down or it's unbearably slow. And so nobody's live demos works. This happens all the time because we've got lots of people accessing at the same time. And for some reason, we can't figure out Wi-Fi. So a backup would be maybe having a video that's embedded into your presentation that doesn't require the internet to run, or having a screen. I like to use this program called Record It to record GIFs live on my computer. And so I'll record GIFs of all the steps that I'm going to take live maybe before I actually get up there and try to do it live. And then obviously practicing a lot is a big part of this. So I know that tip keeps coming up, but I think it's really important. And then finally, the last thing you can do is to sort of coordinate with the organizers, maybe the day the conference starts or the morning before your talk. See if you can get and try on stage a live demo just to see how it works with their equipment, just to make sure. The audiovisual people will maybe have it set up a little early and you can give it a shot and just make sure you know what you're getting into. So that's kind of some of the ways you can de-risk it a bit, but it's still a tricky thing to do and really tricky thing to do really well.
Yeah, so you're saying it's inherently risky, but if you want to go for it, some tips could be to practice it really well. If it's possible to practice it at the venue in the actual room with the equipment you're going to use, and also have a video or some screenshots as a backup that you can use. If it fails, then you don't have to rely on getting it to work. You can just say, okay, never mind, here's a video of me doing it.
Exactly.
That would be some tips that could make it less risky.
Yeah.
And then weighing all of that, what is your final vote? Would you say, yes, try it if it fits your story? Or would you say, no, especially beginning speakers, better to not take the risk?
I say, especially beginner speakers probably shouldn't, first talk, you probably shouldn't try this live demos. Now, rules are meant to be broken, so I'm all for people that want to go for it anyway. I don't ever like to discourage people from from something entirely. If a first-time speaker came to me and she said, I am just super jazzed about this topic and I think I could do a live demo. I've done this 100 times. I feel very confident. I would say, I would give her all the same tips, but I'd say go for it. And so I wouldn't discourage you if you're just set on it, but I would also think about, is there a good way to give the same information without the live demo? Is that the only way to get it across? But again, everybody is different. And I think that's one thing I've taken away from doing these interviews with all these different speakers is everybody's got their own method and their own style. And that's okay. That's great. In fact, I think that's one of the fun things about going to conferences is getting to see all the different styles that are out there and getting to appreciate people who are great live demos or great at making slides or great at showing their libraries they've built and just comparing all these different methods and ways to speak.
Actually, I think that's a very nice way to end the episode. That yes, there are all these tips that we covered in this episode and all the books and all the videos you can see online, but ultimately there are different ways to do it. And part of the experience, I think, as a speaker is also figuring out who you are as a speaker and accepting that indeed it is different for everyone. And there might be things that will not work for anyone except for you. And part of the process is also figuring out what those things are. So I have asked everything I wanted to ask, and I do think that is a great ending. But if there's anything you would like to add, this would be the moment for that.
No, I'm sure you'll have the link to the speaking guide on CFP Land so people can read more if they want to get into that. But we really covered a good portion of it here today. So I just hope everybody, I'm all for more speakers getting up on stage and trying it. So I hope it gets harder and harder for me to get accepted because there's so many great people applying. And I encourage everybody to give it a shot at some point.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. We'll definitely add a link to your Twitter profile and to CFP Land. We will also add the links to the 2 talks that you really liked so people can also look at those for inspiration. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for being on the show today, Karl.
Yeah, thanks, Felienne. It was great talking with you.
Developers, take your marks. It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. It's time to deliver complex mission-critical applications in the fastest route possible. It's time to use any data from any source. It's time to embed analytics and create interactive user interfaces. So what are you waiting for? Choose your language, choose your tools, choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Done and done. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform, the fastest way to build applications. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris. Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.